Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Real Life Pastor. I am John. I am a pastor in real life. Today we're hanging out in our solarium, which has a special friend inside of this solarium. And we're going to also be talking about the topic of how do pastors know what to preach about? How do pastors come up with the content that they're going to preach about every Sunday? So we're going to talk about all those things coming up right after this. This morning we're hanging out in our solarium, and there's something special in this solarium if you haven't caught on yet. We have our veiled chameleon named Jar Jar, and he's right... Oh, this is hard. He's right there. That's him. Right there. He's hiding. It's so early. It's not that early. It's like, was it 6? Just after 6, because I'm up to see the sunrise, so it's probably about 6:15 right now. Yep, 6:15 right now, and his heat lamp is going to come on soon, and I think he's really excited for the heat lamp to come back on. But this is where we keep our veiled chameleon, and he gets the whole bay window in our solarium to himself. He's got 3 palm plants in here, all these fake vines that he gets to climb on. He's got all these lamps everywhere. I probably spent more money on this setup than probably anything I've spent on my dogs. Good morning, Jar Jar. Your light's not even on yet. Did I wake you up? I'm sorry. He's looking at us. Run away! So let's get right to our topic of the day, which is how do pastors know what they're going to preach about? How do they come up with all these ideas week after week? How do they know what their sermon is going to be about? And there's probably a bigger variety than what I'm just going to discuss here in this video, but I want to cover 3 basic ways that pastors figure out what it is that they're going to talk about. The first and most traditional way is what is known as the Revised Common Lectionary. Revised Common Lectionary, as it sounds, it has been revised several times through history, but it's been around for decades, like the 70s and maybe even before that. I think maybe the 70s is when it was first revised, so don't quote me on that. Maybe I'll have some factoids right there. But it's been around for a little while, and basically the Revised Common Lectionary is a 3-year cycle which has scripture reading for every Sunday, every special sort of day of the year, days of obligation if you're Catholic, and that's really where I would say a majority of the pastors out there get their content from. There's a bunch of resources and websites like Text Week that give pastors resources, commentaries on the scripture of the week or what have you. And again, the easiest way to say that is, again, 3-year cycle, has the scriptures already laid out through that 3-year cycle, and pastors that use the Revised Common Lectionary already know what they're going to preach about, technically 3 years in advance, and it works on an ABC cycle. And then came along what is known as the Narrative Lectionary. The Narrative Lectionary, I believe, was devised in 2010. The Narrative Lectionary is similar to the Revised Common Lectionary in that it is a cycle, except it's a 4-year cycle that has all the scriptures laid out through 4 years. But the difference with the Narrative Lectionary is, as it sounds, it attempts to create this sort of narrative of scripture that begins with Old Testament. It begins with Genesis through the prophets to the Gospels, and then through the epistles, the foundings of the church and whatnot, and then kind of rinse and repeat through a 4-year cycle. Our church has actually made the transition to the Narrative Lectionary just this January, so we're kind of new in it, but I'm really enjoying the way that it kind of connects everything. It's not trying to say that it's not trying to say that the Bible in itself is a story so much, but that there is a narrative, that there is a connection that we can see throughout the scriptures to see how God is the one true God who hasn't changed through the life of Christ, through the birth of the church, that our God has been and always will be the one true God. Well, there it is. There's the heat lamp. And Jar Jar's already, he's already up in that. He knew it was coming. So, it's like God's talking right now. So I really like, how does that even happen? I really like the narrative lectionary. I'm enjoying it. But I have used the Revised Common Lectionary in the past. And the third way that pastors will come up with their content or what it is that they're going to preach about, and this sort of, you'll see this more in quote-unquote mega churches or churches that are large and have lots of resources and lots of staff. And that's, there's really no way to say it. They kind of come up with their own content. They sit in a brainstorming room, maybe the pastors all will, or with the youth directors or whatnot, and they'll come up with several sermon series. A lot of them like to use sermon series, and there's nothing, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm kind of tired of the way that everybody in the church throws stones at other churches that don't look like our own churches. So there's nothing wrong with that, but that's how they kind of do it, is by committee. I mean, obviously the senior pastor is going to have more say than everybody else, but they're pretty much going to sit down in this room, brainstorm, okay, through this month, what's this sermon series going to be like, and what kind of scriptures can we use to make up this sermon series. And that's how they that's how they do it. Now, I'm not that good on my own, and my church doesn't have that type of staffing to be able to come up with ideas over and over and over again. So I use like I said before, the narrative lectionary. But even though I use the lectionary, the way I call it is I'm not married to the lectionary. I'm not afraid to go somewhere else, especially if something's going on in the church, if there's a need, like a revitalization that needs to happen, or maybe we're having trouble coming up with volunteers, and I feel like the church needs to hear a message on stewardship and things like that. I am completely, and I do it all the time, I'm completely fine with breaking away from the lectionary for a week or two, so that we can address what the church really needs at any given time. As far as the life of the church goes, we're not all going through the same seasons at the same time, so the scriptures that are going to happen every week in a lectionary is not going to hit every church in the same way, depending on what season they are in their life. So as far as I'm concerned, I view the lectionaries as a tool, and only as a tool, and just as a hammer is good for putting nails into a board, it is not good for cutting that board. So as a tool, the lectionaries, I personally believe, should not be used as a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. I don't personally look at the lectionary and say, I have to preach about this topic. I have to preach on this scripture every week, because I feel like it ties our church down, that we aren't always going to hear the messages that we need maybe in that moment. And it's kind of a shame when you realize that you preached on something maybe 3 months ago, and you're like, we could really use that now, sort of thing. So I'm like, since we've transitioned to the narrative lectionary, I actually stick to it a lot more than I did when I was with the Revised Common Lectionary. When I would use the Revised Common Lectionary, I probably used it only about half the time, and the rest of the time I was able to sort of come up with content on my own, because of that reason, because what we were hearing, I say this, and as it comes out, it kind of sounds bad, but like, there are certain times in our life where we need a certain type of scripture, right? We all have had those moments where scripture comes to us, maybe through the radio, or we're just doing our own Bible studies, and we needed that, right? In the same way, the life of the church needs different scriptures at different times. I know I'm kind of like broken record right now, but I really truly believe that with all my heart, that just as a person needs a scripture at a certain time, just as the person needs a lesson from God at a certain time or season in their life, it's the same thing for the church. So, not to burst anybody's bubble, but the odds are that your pastor is not coming up on this content on their own. They're writing the sermon on their own, and we'll have another video on how I sort of do sermon prep and writing and research and all that sort of stuff. But as far as the topic and the scripture, most of our pastors already know what they're going to talk about because they have these resources. And one of the great things about this resource, don't get me wrong, it's kind of like seeing the magic behind Disney World. Like once you go behind the scenes, the magic's kind of like gone a little bit. It's kind of the same thing here where you may not have known this about your pastor. I don't mean to out any pastors out there, but one of the really good things about using a lectionary, I've already kind of talked about reasons why it's not foolproof. One of the things that makes the lectionary a tool that we should use is because it gets us to diversify our preaching portfolio a little bit and make sure that we're not preaching on the same things every week, which is if you're coming up with your own content, especially if you don't have like a worship and ministry team that comes up with content. If you're only preaching, what you want to preach, you'll probably get into a little bit of a pit or a rut there at some point. And the Revised Common Lectionary and the Narrative Lectionary help keep us moving forward, helps keep us diverse and making sure that we're kind of stretching ourselves as well as stretching the church. And that's a really good resource that pastors need and should have. But for now, I hope you enjoyed everything that you heard in this video. If you did, go ahead and subscribe, like, thumbs up, hit that notification bell, share if you feel so inclined to do so, and we hope to see you next time on Real Life Pastor. Thanks, everybody.